So what happened between 1822 and 1835? Now I know I said 1820 in the other video, but really it was 1822. If you'll remember, that's the year, and I wrote it over here, that Stephen F. Austin brought the old 300, the first settlers, the first families under the land grant system, okay, under the land grant system, to live in Texas. And hostilities began. The first fighting started in 1835. So a short period of time, 13 years. I said 16, it was really 13 years. So I'm going to title this section 1822 to 1835. And the question is, what made all of the Americans, because they really were, I mean, they were still Americans, even though they had to say that they were Mexican citizens, they had to become Mexican citizens, they really were Americans, probably in their hearts anyway, right? What made them want to break free of Mexico, right? Now, we need to set some context, some background in order to answer this question, all right? And the first thing we need to know is that there were some rules that Mexico asked or wanted these settlers to follow, settlers from the U.S. to follow. There were some rules. So let's call this rules. All right. So they had to become citizens, Mexican citizens. They had to learn Spanish. These are the official rules at the time. They had to learn Spanish. They had to practice Catholicism. Catholicism, if I can spell. I think that's right. For some reason I can't spell enough. Practice Catholicism. They had to be Catholic. They had to not... They weren't supposed to bring slaves into Texas. And they had to get permission from the nearest Mexican official, wherever they moved to, the nearest Mexican official to live there. Now we have to remember the times. It's not like there was, there wasn't a border. There wasn't a checkpoint. There wasn't any kind of a gate that you had to go through. Not even really roads. I mean, kind of roads, right? But not like roads like we think of roads today. So they just took their horse or their wagon, and there might have been a beaten path that people followed, but not like a highway or anything, even like a little small, country road. They just can wander in anywhere along the border of this area, okay, into Texas, and and live, set up shop. And we've already seen that there wasn't a big government presence in Texas, okay. Only 7,800 citizens, or Mexican citizens, people who came from Mexico, from the south, right, settlers still, compared to 30,000 settlers from the U.S., okay. So that's our context. They had a bunch of rules that they were supposed to follow, and what's important to remember is that most of those rules, many of those rules, they just got ignored, okay. These become citizens, learn Spanish, all those rules, they just got ignored. Bringing slaves into Texas. Slaves got brought into Texas. A lot of slaves got brought into Texas. So that by 1836, there was about 5,000 slaves in Texas. 5,000 slaves versus 30,000 to 1 to 6, right? 1/6. That's a lot of folks who got brought in, okay? And those rules just got ignored, right? Well, things started to change. And we have to remember these things. Things started to change, right? So in 1829, slavery was outlawed in Mexico. But how are they going to enforce that if they're going to make the Texans not have slaves? Well, in 1830, the Mexican government outlawed slaves in Texas. They said you have to get rid of them, or the army's going to come and get rid of them for you. Okay, so that was one big point that at least a lot of Texans had contentions with. Right, but there was another big problem. Well, by 1830, okay, 1830, the same year, there were so many people coming. We saw, right, 30,000 by 1836. There were so many people coming to Texas from the U.S. that now the Mexican government was afraid of losing control of Texas. They were afraid of losing Texas because they were vastly outnumbered by folks from the U.S. in Texas. Okay, people who had been governing themselves by and large, right? Which was one of the complaints, right, that they had. So, and we'll get to that in just a moment. So, in 1830, the Mexican government made some changes. All right, and here are the changes. Okay, so the changes. They had to pay property taxes. So now all these folks living in Texas, they're going to have to start paying taxes that they didn't have to pay before. Okay, that's one big complaint. Another was tariffs entering goods from the U.S. There's tariffs on goods from the U.S. Those tariffs were going to be enforced. People were going to have to start paying tariffs. So the cost of goods coming from the U.S. was going to go up. Okay, the cost on those goods was going to go up. And another big one, maybe the biggest one, immigration was stopped. At least officially. Okay, officially immigration was stopped. Now, practically, was immigration stopped? No, because how do you stop it if you have a really small government presence? But these were some of the changes that people in Texas didn't like. Okay, they were used to governing themselves, running themselves, and now immigration is going to be stopped. The price on our goods is going to go up, and these property taxes we didn't have to pay them before. We're going to have to pay them now. Okay, so those were some of the problems. There were other complaints. Well, one was a lack of funding for schools. One was low pay for militias. One was they didn't have protection against Indian attacks, against attacks by Native Americans, right? Especially Comanche. Okay, in this part of the state, in the middle part of the state here. And there was no government representation in the Mexican government. All right, no government representation here because it was a territory. It was a Mexican territory. All right, it wasn't a state. It wasn't a Mexican state. All right, so they didn't have government representation. All right. Well, in 1832, they petitioned. I'm just going to put a petition, okay? Texans, a group of Texans, they petitioned the government down in Mexico to let Texas become a state of Mexico, not of the U.S., but of Mexico. They petitioned in 1832 for the government down in Mexico City to let Texas become a state of Mexico. And that was rejected by the Mexican government. All right, they said, no, we're going to keep it as a territory, which meant that they didn't have any government representation still here in Mexico. Right? So Stephen F. Austin, if you'll remember Stephen F. Austin, okay, he went to, I'll put SFA to Mexico City. He went down to Mexico City. That doesn't really look like Mexico City, sorry. Stephen F. Austin went to Mexico City to petition in person the Mexican government to allow Texas to become a state. Okay, 1832. Well, this was after 1832. Sorry, he went down to. And he went down there. While he was there, he sent a letter back to Texas. Okay, he sent a letter back to Texas. And he urged the Texans to go ahead and set up a government anyway. Go ahead and set up a government to become a state anyway. Now, the Mexican government intercepted that letter. They found out what he wrote, and they put him in jail for a year in Mexico City. And that caused some problems. Again, some more anger, resentment, right? So this was all the buildup, okay? And this takes us all the way to 1835. 1835. Okay, these were the big events. All right, what's the, if we could put this in one sentence for you? The Texans were used to running themselves, governing themselves, and then that was going to change starting about 1830. Okay, the rules were going to change, and the Texans didn't like it. And then the denial at statehood by the Mexican government, right? That they didn't like that either. And 1835, hostilities began. That's when the fighting began, and the thing that we call the Texas Revolution. And we're going to look at that in the next video.